So, it's the 1,000-day anniversary of the war in Ukraine. 1,000 days of war between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, we can see all the things we can expect from this anniversary. President Zelensky, who did a speech in the European Parliament, and all the European bigwigs, all the members of the European Parliament who basically virtue signaled their asses off over there. They even had a little photo booth where they could do a photo with themselves, a selfie with themselves, holding up a placard saying, "We'll support Ukraine for as long as it takes." All the usual things. On the other hand, we've seen the Russians who did a agitation propaganda piece on Russian TV where they said that they can wipe out Western Europe with their nuclear missiles in a couple of minutes, and that they can wipe out Britain in a couple of minutes. I mean, nothing we haven't seen before, right? We see lots of war rhetoric and no real solutions. But in the meantime, we do have to realize the fact that this is a conflict between NATO and the Russians on the one hand, so between two nuclear powers, and that it might be time to dial down the war rhetoric and actually let cooler heads prevail before someone makes a stupid mistake and by accident or intent launches a nuclear missile on Berlin or Brussels or whatever. These things happen. These accidents can happen. There's a reason why they call it mad, mutually assured destruction, because it's mad, it's insane. So we are actually balancing on the knife edge right now. It could go horribly wrong. It probably won't go horribly wrong. It might not go horribly wrong, at least more horribly wrong than it has been going so far. But it could go horribly wrong. So maybe right now it's time for the cooler heads to prevail. And maybe right now it's actually time for people to start to think about how can we get a peace in Ukraine? How can we build a peace between the Russians and the Ukrainians? Practically speaking, without the rhetoric. Because people are tired on both sides. And this is the thing. We need to realize, though, that both sides have reasons to want to stop this war. On the one hand, the Russians have a reason to want to stop this war because lots of Russians are getting killed, lots of ordinary Russians are getting killed, but beyond that, the Russian economy is facing some difficulty. It's very simple. Financially speaking, they had a war chest. The Russian state had a war chest of a couple of trillion euros equivalent, which they specifically saved up so they could invade Ukraine or do some sort of operation like this. So we know that they were planning this, by the way, because they had that war chest. But that war chest is emptying. It's getting empty. And at this moment, this war chest, the Russian war chest, has already emptied. So basically the Russians are now cannibalizing their own economy to fuel the war in Ukraine. This is something that cannot go on forever. And we've seen this, for instance, with what the Russian central bank is doing, that they're raising interest rates, stuff like that. These are measures taken by a government which knows that its economy cannot go on like this forever, and that their funds are basically running dry. Now, the Russians can keep on going for a while. They can keep on going because Russians are historically used to poverty, hardship, war, stuff like that. They will basically just keep on going. But financially speaking, and economically speaking, the Russian economy simply cannot keep the war economy going forever. At some point, they're going to scrape bottom, and then you're going to have a financial crisis in Russia. And at that point, they simply will not be able to afford the war in Ukraine anymore. Because the wars they're fighting in Ukraine right now, it's a 21st century war, not the Second World War, which was a lot more low-tech than what they're doing right now. So you're going to need companies for that. You're going to need financing for that. You're going to need all the 21st century possibilities and necessities of fighting a war, and the Russians are nearing the bottom of the barrel. On the other hand, we have the Ukrainians, who also have a good reason to want to stop this war. The fact that a large part of their territory is occupied by the Russians, the fact that they are losing lots of people, lots of Ukrainians, the fact that also their economy, it has taken a hit, although not nearly as much as the Russian economy. Basically, both the Russians and the Ukrainians have good reasons to want to stop this war. The only thing that they don't have is an excuse to stop the war, because they need an excuse. Specifically, their politicians need an excuse, something that they can show their followers and say, their people, and say that, well, mission accomplished. We have said that we're going to do this, and we have achieved this, so now we can go home, we can hand out the medals. Basically, we can say, well done, you brave soldiers, and you can go back home. They need an excuse. So we need to give them that excuse. So what excuse can we give the Russians? And what excuse can we give the Ukrainians to want to end this war? Well, on the one hand, the Ukrainians, if we can convince the Russians to withdraw back into Russia, then the Ukrainians will have what they wanted. Then Zelensky can say, well, we have pushed back the Russians off our territory, so mission accomplished. It's as simple as that. We have repelled the foreign invaders, so well done. All right, that's simple. That's for the Ukrainians. Now for the Russians, don't forget, at first they said that this was a special military operation to denazify Ukraine. All right, let's give them the excuse that they need, which is that they can say that they denazified Ukraine. How do we do that? Well, specifically, you need to understand that denazifying means no NATO, no Western involvement, no US specifically involvement in Ukraine. So, why not turn Ukraine into a neutral state, a neutral buffer state between the EU on the one hand and Russia on the other? Just temporarily, until things get into normal again. A neutral Ukraine. So we can say that the Russians retreat back into Russia. Ukraine becomes an official neutral state between the East and the West. They don't become part of NATO. They also don't become part of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is basically run by Russia, as all the ex-Soviet nations basically. They are neutral, not part of one, not part of the other. But they take care of themselves. Now, that would already be a huge victory for the Russian leadership to save face, because they can say, see, we kicked NATO out of Ukraine. We kicked the Americans out of Ukraine. And this is also very important. No Americans in Ukraine. We know they're there, right? We know that they are deeply involved in this shit. So no Americans in Ukraine. No NATO in Ukraine. The Ukrainians, would become neutral, armed neutrality, so they can fight for themselves, so they can fend for themselves. And indeed, we can put a clause in there saying that if the Russians ever invade Ukraine again, fine, the West will help, or Europe specifically will help Ukraine fend them off, and vice versa. America ever becomes involved in Ukraine again, or Ukraine decides to join NATO, even though they're supposed to be neutral, then Russia has some options there as well. It's a balance, right? This is the kind of way you can negotiate these things. You can negotiate these things. And this is the one thing that's not being done right now, negotiating between the two different sides, saying that, what can we do? What can we give the different sides to not make them lose face to their own people? Because this is very important here. This is a battle of egos to a very large extent, a battle of egos, where politicians do not want to lose face against one another, and especially not lose face to their own people. So what can we do to not make people lose face? Well, give them an excuse to end the war and say, mission accomplished, I have done what I've promised. This way the Russians, they can pull back into Russia and say, well, we've pushed NATO out of Ukraine, we've pushed the Americans out of Ukraine, and probably, yes, Zelensky would also have to resign for that. But I don't see how that could be a problem, because elections were supposed to have been held in Ukraine anyway, but was postponed because of the war. So as soon as the war was over, new elections would have to be called, and as a gesture of goodwill, basically Zelensky could then step down as president, which he would have to do anyway, basically, because for a new election, well, he would either be re-elected, yes or no, and then he can run again as president of Ukraine if he wants to, or he can just say, well, I've done my duty, and go down into Ukrainian history as the hero who defended the motherland against the evil invader. He could do that. But with that in hand, the Russians could say to their people, see, we have effectively denazified. We have effectively defended our borders. While on the other hand, the Ukrainians can say, we've effectively defended our borders. We have effectively pushed the invaders out. We have effectively liberated our occupied territory. And what then about those those people's republics like Luhansk, right, and Donetsk? Well, there's also stuff we can figure out there. There's solutions there. Right now they have been annexed into Russia, into the Russian Federation. But let's be honest, is this a done deal? The situation there is a bit volatile, right? It's a bit, not quite, because the Ukrainians still claim that is theirs, the Russians claim that it is theirs, so it's a bit in the balance. All right, what can we do there then? We can, for instance, say that, fine, those two breakaway republics, they don't stay in Russia, they don't stay in Ukraine, they become independent, semi-independent buffer states, and in, let's say, 30 years' time, when there's a whole new generation of people living there, they can do a referendum, a plebiscite, and decide for themselves whether they want to be Russian or Ukrainian. And in the meantime, the Russians and Ukrainians can basically try and convince the people who live there where they want to belong to. That's a solution. Other solution, you could say, those people's republics, they return to Ukraine, but they become semi-independent federal republics within Ukraine, where the people who live there, they run themselves pretty much the same way, but statutory they become part of Ukraine again, but in reality they're basically like a semi-independent part of Ukraine. My point is, there are solutions there. There are solutions there. If you just use your brain and stay cool and collected and actually think, what can we do to promote peace between these nations, stop this really, really, really pointless war, and actually figure out a way forward towards the future, rather than just continuing to say, we're just going to continue this war no matter what, we're going to support this or that or whatever, and we're going to drop nukes and we're going to drop missiles and we're going to drop everything, and we're just going to use some hardware to blast the enemy into smithereens, No, that does not work. That sort of American gung-ho cowboy shit does not work. And again, the Russians do this too, right? They're the ones who say that they want to bomb Western Europe with nukes on TV. So they're not innocent either, right? Let's be honest about this. They're not innocent either. On the other hand, the Ukrainians are not entirely innocent either, because they have stepped in bed with the Yanks. And why are Americans busy on European soil in Ukraine? Do they belong there? No, they don't. Do they have any real business there? No, they don't. They have no business there, yet they are there. John Kerry, damn it, senior American politician, was in Kiev before the war in Ukraine, basically telling the people on the Maidan Square, telling the people that, you need to rise up and fight for your rights and fight for Ukraine and so on and so forth. Why was he doing that? He's an American, so he doesn't actually belong there. Why would you listen to an American in Europe? It's just a question, just a question. So to recap, yes, there are solutions. to this war in Ukraine, this war between Russia and Ukraine. There are total solutions to this. But the prerequisite of this is that people start thinking with their heads and that people keep it cool and that people don't do this war rhetoric, because this war is utterly pointless. It just destroys money, it just destroys people, it just destroys lives, it just destroys infrastructure, it just destroys everything. That's the point of this war. It's wealth destruction, it's people destruction, it's infrastructure destruction. It's basically so Europe and America and Russia, they can all pour their resources in something that is completely pointless and doesn't actually build something better. And thus we continue. Thus we continue in this endless spiral of pointlessness. But we can do something about this. We can do something about this. And this also shows you how useless the politicians of Europe and also America and also Russia really are. If some random guy on the internet can figure out a real solution that would actually work in practice to this war, if some random guy on the internet could basically be peace broker in a 1,000-day war, then you have to ask yourself, why can't the politicians whose job it actually is to do this shit? Because they don't want to. Because they benefit from this war and all these wars. Because they have shares in weapons manufacturing plants. Because they think it boosts their ratings if they do virtue signaling. Simply because they profit. Well, let them not profit anymore from war. Let's just get a real peace. Build a real peace in Europe again. So, if you are a Ukrainian, if you are a Russian, if you are a European, I'm not going to say if you're an American, because as an American you have no business in Europe. But if you belong to these people, then talk to your people about this, about the fact that a real peace is possible where you can get what you want. Think about this. Think about the possibility of ending this pointless conflict. And all it takes is a neutral Ukraine. A neutral Ukraine where people, whether Ukrainians or Russians, can rebuild their lives again and build a better, more productive and peaceful future for all. Thank you very much. Now, if you agree with the fact that this war is completely pointless, and if you agree with the fact that we actually need a peace in Ukraine and a solution for the war in Ukraine, and if you agree with the fact that politicians are simply not doing their jobs, and that it is time for ordinary people, basically, to find the solutions where the politicians have failed to, then please, I ask you, share this video. Share this video. Because I believe that peace in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, is really a possibility. I also believe that we need to build this peace before some general or politicians or whatever does something really stupid. More stupid. So if you want to establish a peace in Ukraine, peace between Russia and Ukraine, then don't forget to share this video with everyone you believe wants peace rather than war.